Hello, my name is Oskar, and today I'll be trying to persuade you that Cqrs might be simpler than you think, especially with the new goodies from .NET. Who am I? I'm developer advocate at Store. Besides that, I'm a still active developer for over 14 years. Also, I were architect, technical leader. Besides our official channels, you can find me and follow me on Twitter. You can check my blog. I'm trying to every week write something around event-driven approach or architecture. But that will be probably enough about me because I won't be talking much about myself, but I'll be talking a bit about my preferences and why I think that Cqrs is a really helpful pattern. There are a lot of myths and a lot of mishaps around explaining Cqrs. So I'll be trying to explain some of them and tell why I believe that Cqrs is in fact a simple pattern. For some people, this architecture is simple. For me, not so much, even looking at this picture. So I prefer to call it onion architecture, not only because of the number of layers, but also of the specific smell, code smell, of course. So today I'll be trying to show you why slicing your architecture vertically should help you in building more manageable applications, but especially effectively work with the code, because that's related. So how splitting your application by behavior should help you in being effective and building applications closer to business. And that's my last slide today, because this will be a really hands-on webinar. There will be no event sourcing, no event store DB, because I would like to get into the roots of Cqrs and explain Cqrs as it is, or in fact, as I see it. So I'm planning to do a follow-up webinar when I will be explaining how to apply what we learn to event sourcing and event store DB. But today, I would like to focus on Cqrs, because I believe that one of the most common issues while explaining Cqrs is mixing that with event sourcing, eventual consistency, queuing, and messaging. We won't be using any of that today. So let's jump into the code. And let's start with explaining what's the acronym Cqrs means. C stands for comment. For example, register product. And Q stands for query. For example, get product details. And the last two letters are standing for responsibility segregation. So Cqrs is not about model, so splitting your storage model into two databases. For some reason, from the initial work by Greg Young, that's the only picture that most of the people found the most interesting and are showing on the internet. Cqrs is not about storage. It's also not about queuing and not about eventual consistency. Cqrs is about breaking your system operation based on the intent of what they are trying to do. So comment is an intent to mutate the state. So comment should do something, but should not return any data in general. Pragmatically, we can return some status or some information about the result of our operation, but our intent when we are sending comment is not to get the data, but to mutate the state. On the other hand, query is like if you are asking a question, the question should not change the answer. So query is about getting the data, not about mutating the state and not causing side effects. If we are splitting those behavior, then we are getting cleaner and more straightforward code. So it doesn't mean that if we are handling command, we cannot read any data that we need, but we should not return data. Especially that, like I said, CQRS is a higher abstraction. It doesn't state anything about the storage. So what does it precisely mean that segregate responsibility? So from my perspective, the easiest to explain that is to introduce two small interfaces. One is command handler, and the other one is a query handler. So Greg Young told that we are splitting processing of intents into two objects. And by object, it doesn't mean the tables or databases. It means that we are splitting processing into two separate handlers or services. So command handler should take just command, do some processing. That's why we are using value task here, because it might be asynchronous. And query should also take the query, but return the result. It might be also asynchronous, so I'm using value task here. If we would like to make it more straightforward without the .NET specifics, then the interface would be probably something like that. And for synchronous processing, that's perfectly valid. So it means that we are sending command and we expect that something will happen, but no data will be returned. And for query, we expect to get the data and not make side effects. So that's what it, if you get back to the original works, which I highly recommend, then if you found out this object definition, then it means splitting and so routing your operations into slices and handling them separately with different intents. So if you were not working with the .NET 5, then record might seem a bit weird, especially that normally you would expect to have it underlined with the red color, but record is a new shortened definition for class. In fact, it's a syntactic sugar, so we'll get into that in a bit. If we would like to define some command that would be closer to a real life, then we would add like a product ID, unique product number, name, and maybe optional description. That's also something. So this question mark is something that was added with the C#8. So it's a nullable reference type. Previously, for reference types like strings, like classes, we couldn't mark it that we expect that it might be null or not. If we were trying to access the specific field, then we always need to guess whether it's a null or not. So we'll see that it's not so ideal, but it's also syntactic sugar, but we can enable that if we just add nullable enable in our project. So this is extremely useful, as we will see later on. So this is like the simplest command. So we want to register product, so add a product with a specific ID and specific information. And record we can use as regular classes. So we can use new, and what we defined here, it's already a constructor definition. So that's pretty cool. The other benefit that we are getting with records is immutability, because if we are sending a comment and we expect it to handle that with our business logic, then we should not be changing this comment, because this is intent that we are getting from the user. So we expect that it will be untouched, so immutable. And in fact, using record, we get it like that. As you see, this is init only, so it can be only assigned during object initialization. So TLDR when we are adding constructor. So far, so good. So about the nullable reference type, if we try to put null here, so if we, for some reason, try to not provide a value because we marking here this as not nullable, then we will get compiler warning. So which is good because again, compiler will be guarding us of not making a stupid mistakes. However, we can use a magical exclamation mark. If someone is using TypeScript, then it should be familiar. So unfortunately, nullable reference types is just the syntactic sugar. So we can force compiler to just ignore that and provide null value. Of course, we can say like, well, if someone enabled the nullable reference type, then probably it won't be so dumb to just add an exclamation mark or just ignore it. And probably that might be true, but we need to remember that constructors are not only called directly by our code. If we are deserializing, for example, a HTTP request, then we don't have any control about how the data will be provided. So if this, for example, name property wasn't available there, then .NET won't help us here and won't guard us because it will just take null value. With the C#10, we will get a required field, which might help on that, but this is something that will come later, not sooner than in .NET 6. So yeah, it's not ideal, and we'll see in a bit that records are also not so great, you should be careful of using them for various cases. So if we try to expand the record and see what precisely this part means, then it will appear that this is the same, or more or less the same, as we would write a record like that. So the parameters that we had previously, so GUID, product, etc. Maybe I will leave it on top so you could see the comparison. So we in C#9, we get a new modifier, which is called init, and it means that it can be only initiated in constructor, or as you will see in initialization that was added to records. So that's a new syntax, but this definition is the same as this constructor. So far, so good. If we try then to create new record, then we can create it not only by constructor, but we can also create it like that. So let's see this register product. And let's try to create a new product based on that. We can use a syntax that we will use the other object and use with. So for example, with description equal to new description. And it will create a new object. So this init syntax allows you to not only pass it through constructor, but also through that initializer. This syntax will create a new copy of that object with the values changed as we have it here. So this is quite okay, but not always, because if we get back and change the definition of our register product command, then we'll see that if we would like to have some additional validation, like make sure that product ID is not GUID empty, if SKU is in a specific format, then such codes won't help us. So records are great for data transfer objects, but not so great for value object when we expect our object to be created and following the specific semantic rules. So we can extend it and add a static factory method. That's my personal preference, but not only mine, because in functional languages, it's called smart constructor. So we are giving all the values like that they can be nullable, etc., and without following the rules. And then we can verify whether, for example, ID is not empty, if name and number is longer than empty string, etc. We could add all the validations that we would expect to have it here. So if we instead creating a constructor, if we add it here, then like I said, the init won't let us to initialize it later on. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that will be good. So if we want to make the object really immutable, so if we would like to block something that I will show you later on, like for example, passing empty description, then right now, if we remove those inits, then we will get compiler error that we cannot use this initialization. But if we allow that and keep init here, then we would be doomed because we could pass an empty string and because it wouldn't go through those validations. And so I personally prefer to have more control and have a bit more verbose code like that and create a private constructor. Then all of my objects are created with this factory. Why am I not just copying here and using it here? Because as I mentioned, this constructor can be also used during the deserialization. Typically, comments are belongs to the domain layer, so we expect to not be serialized, etc. But if we have like a command that will be sent to other microservice, etc., then depending on our implementation detail, then it might be deserialized. If we are splitting the validation logic and construction logic from the potential serialization logic, then we are safer. And our types are more predictable. So if we are using them later on, then we don't need to do all validations around those properties because we know that this object is correct. That will be all about the records. Does anyone have questions around it? If not, then I can continue. I'm using Rider right now. Yeah, case classes in Scala, I believe that there are not so great as case classes in Scala or like types in F#, but records are a decent step forward. So we just need to be careful and remember that they are not so great for value objects if we need to verify some additional business rules. And they are really good for shortening syntax and for data transfer objects. So that where we expect that data might be wrong. So we can define the records the query in the same way. So here we will be just passing the product ID because we want to get the exact product details data. And again, we can have some validation. But like I said, if you are fine with the record limitation, you don't have to write those static methods, and you don't need to keep the constructor private. I personally just want to be sure, following the type-driven approach, that my types are saved and predictable. But if you feel fine, then sure, just use the records and keep the syntax short. Or someone could say, just use F#. Yeah, can deserialize use the private constructor? Yes, it can. Newtonsoft supports that really well. For system text JSON, you would need to add JSON constructor, and that will be enough. So the next the next part that I would like to explain. So why am I using so dump domain? So product and warehouse. So creating product, getting product. Potentially, I could add command for updating product description. I'm using that domain to show that Cqrs is not about storage. It's not about the pattern that we use behind that, our storage pattern. It's about segregating the behavior, and it can be even useful in such dump domains like CRUD. So I decided to select a warehouse because to me that's like one of the most CRUDish examples. Do you have some more CRUDish examples? If you have, feel free to comment. I would be curious. Maybe I will use it later on in my samples. So let's define product, because we will be using that class together with entity framework. Yep. You can still use Cqrs with your favorite ORM or your favorite way to store data. As I said, Cqrs is storage agnostic. So product can be entity. If we would like to follow the domain-driven design principles, then we could also make the constructor private. We could add some business logic here, but for the sake of simplicity, I will be just using the raw entity. So nothing fancy. You already know that I would like to add product with some number, name, and optional description. So here we are using the entity framework, the database context that is just taking the entity as it is, and let's move forward. So as you see, I'm using the single file for defining all of that. There are no right now compiler errors, and that's also something new that was added in a .NET 5. And it will be expanded even more in the .NET 6. So the direction that .NET is going is to be closer to the accessibility that we are getting in Node.js or Python, etc. You can disagree that maybe it will make our applications not so sophisticated as previously, because .NET was mostly perceived as an enterprise framework. But those are the changes that are needed, for example, to enable serverless, easier startup, faster startup, and also learning the patterns as they come. So right now in .NET 5 and upcoming .NET 6, we can define our application within the single file. So as you see, I'm having here a usings, and I'm creating a new host. This is also something new in .NET 5, because web host was moved inside the host initialization, and host is the most generic how to start and how to host .NET applications. So we will go forward and we will try to configure also the basic web application that would be taking our commands. So we'll be able to register product and getting the product details. And we are using the web builder for that. This is something that you normally see in a startup class if you were using the traditional approach. And here we can define that we will be using routing, and we will be also setting the DB context. And I'm using Postgres because I like Postgres, but you could use whatever you want, also not entity framework. That's probably not something that I like the most, but still. And we will say that we will be also using routines, and we will be defining endpoints. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of MVC approach in regards to WebAPI. For me, it's more aligned with the presentation layer. So if you are using Razor, then of course you have views. But if you have WebAPI, then is it really MVC? For me, it's not. So I personally prefer to just define endpoints and handling them as they come without grouping all of the different endpoints with different characteristics within the same file. For example, if we have even the simple product API, then probably getting the list of product will be called much more often than adding new products. Probably the difference will be huge. So if we are defining the same controller to handling both getting products and creating products, then we need to host it in the same API and have the same capabilities and the same size of resources. So we are limiting our optimization. So that's why I believe that besides it's really nice aligned with the CQRS principles, that it might be better to just define a specific endpoints, because then we are getting flexibility and potentially better scalability, or we can easier split our code base and even take out microservices if we see that this could be useful. Yeah, thank you, Eric. I'm glad that you also MVC hater like me. Okay, so let's define how our command handling could look like if we are using the endpoints approach. So with the .NET 5, we are getting a method that allows us to read JSON from request. In .NET 3.1, it wasn't possible. You would need to write your own serializer. In .NET 6, this will be even simpler. So you don't have to use the HTTP context. You can just provide an object and it will be automatically deserialized. So what I'm showing here today is what we have now, but this is also direction that .NET team is moving forward to simplify the code. If we are using endpoints, we can still use the dependency injection if you like to use it. You don't have to. Yes, Augustine, .NET 6 called that minimal APIs. So we can get our DB context from IOC if we prefer. And then if we want to create new product, then we can just call the constructor, get the data from our comment, and use the entity framework API to edit, save changes, then return the created status, provide a location to the newly created resource, and then just write the response, so the newly created product ID. So if I would like to show you that this is really simple, then you might say that, well, maybe it's simple, but it's also tedious. If I have to do so much code and put it in the same file, then it's not so great, right? And in fact, I would agree with that, because we are mixing here different things. So at first, request processing and deserialization. Then getting our code injection and also so-called business logic. Then we are also using the directly manipulation on the HTTP response. So this is having potential for the spaghetti code. That's something that we would like to get. But also, on the other hand, if you have a look on this code, then it's quite clear what is going on. So it's not so bad. But in the next steps, we will be refactoring that and showing how this could look like in the real and enterprise or enterprisey application. So but let's just finish our sample. So we can have, in the same way, we can get the ID from root, because in endpoints, we can still use all of the good things that we have in regular controllers, or almost all. we don't have model binding, but we have all those routing syntax. We can wrap it with the middlewares and etc. So we are not losing much. In a .NET 6, we will also get Swagger for that. In .NET 5, it's not so simple. But .NET 6 will probably come within the next month. Yeah, good comment, good question, Andrzej. I will try to, so how this comment will behave when product constructor throws something. So if the product throws something, then this will be, exception will be thrown further on, and the default mapping behavior will be run. So if you don't define your own middleware, then probably it will be 500. But that's also the reason, and we'll see later on, why am I using this constructor, smart constructor, so this factory method, because if we will be using that, and we will be using that in a moment, then, for example, argument out of range exception is by default translated into 400, so bad request. So that's not much different. The exception handling is exactly the same as for the regular controllers. So let's maybe sum up with what we have right now. So we defined that CQRS is not about state, not about messaging, it's about responsibility segregation. So we are defining that we expect that comment will be changing the state and query will be returning the state. But what we can use is our implementation detail. So we can even use the entity framework. We can still be using, like we traditionally do, entities. We don't need to use DDD. Of course, it is good matching, but if we prefer to keep it simple, then we can still use entities. We can use records to simplify our command handling, or as I suggested, we can use extended records. So create strongly typed and strongly verified objects that we will be sure that are following some rules that we can define. And then if we would like to create a really simple API, then we can even do it within the single file, because that's the code that if you just copy and paste it, then it will expose the endpoint to adding new product and getting it by ID. And making also other types of comments like updating description or making product inactive, it will be exactly the same pattern, and exactly the same pattern we can use for other queries to get the state. However, as I said, this is not like we would be shaping our applications typically. So let's open our tree structure, and let's see how I typically structuring the code base. So I'm usually taking the biggest modules and group at first modules within the specific project, so DLL. Then within that project, I'm creating a sub-modules. Usually, in my case, sub-modules are related to aggregates, so to entities. So I'm always trying to use the feature folders, because it's, especially with the CQRS, it makes to keep related code together and shape also slice it further on. So if we would like to keep our sub-modules and modules sliced, so following the CQRS pattern, then I would recommend to just create subfolders within submodules per business operation. So in this case, it might be registering product, it might be getting product details, And if we have more submodules within the warehouse, like for example, inventory for verifying whether we have the exact quantity of product in our warehouse, or if we would like to have availability search, then we could also create submodules based on that. And then we can have, for example, query folder, like check get product availability, and we could go further on, but we will focus on our specific case. So registering product as an example of command, and getting product details as an example of query. And there is a question from Augustine. So whether modules are euphemism for microservices. Might be. I wasn't thinking about that, but in general, I don't like to use microservices. I'm sometimes using them because that's more straightforward for the others. Because from my personal experience, microservices are not so micro usually. For me, microservice would be potentially an aggregate that would be a microservice. Or if we are using serverless, then maybe the specific method would be a nano service. So it's hard to say whether service is micro or not. So I prefer to at first focus on the logical split. So how I would like to shape and organize my code, and then think how to deploy that. Because as you see, I have a dedicated warehouse API project where we were creating this program CS. But if we prefer, then we could just take those endpoints, as you will see later on, and move it and deploy to other service. Because in my opinion, just a business case is not enough to split deployment within the multiple services. There are more for that, more cases. So I prefer, when I'm talking about modules, then I'm talking about the logical split. So how am I grouping? This might be called also bounded context. So that's my naming. Yeah, and Andreas had similar idea. And yeah, it's Cqrs is kind of similar to GraphQL, because GraphQL has mutations where you can define a specific state mutation and queries. So it's a similar, but Cqrs is more explicit because we are explicitly saying about our business case and our business operation. So what we are expecting to have. Okay, so let's maybe define how we could shape our business application, like the real one, not the single file application. By the way, in the .NET 5 and .NET 6, we might have not only single page application, but also single file application. Yes, that's a lame joke, but whatever. Okay, let's define how we would place an endpoint. So for example, we could keep together not only the business handling, but also the endpoints definition together. So if we have the registering product, then we could have the endpoint definition like here. We could create extension methods that will be using the endpoint route builder and will define how our endpoint should look like. And what we can do is to go here and take this definition, because as you see, this is exactly the same endpoint route builder, cut and paste it here. And for the sake of fluent pattern, return endpoints. So see, we can move our route and put it together and slice as we are slicing by the business operation. And right now, as you can see, we are missing some other stuff like comment, like DB context and product. So as I mentioned, the main modules, usually I'm splitting by the business unit, so it can be entity, aggregate. So let's move also product here. And let's go to our program and also clean it up. Where do we have our product? So we have it here. And let's move it here. And again, we have our product definition. And let's also create a data DB context. So here, this is the only distinction that I'm doing from the business feature folder, because that's a pragmatic approach, because if we are expecting that this will be kind of modular monolith, then probably we would like to have also the single DB context. But if you prefer, you can even split it into separate contexts, separate databases, but let's try to keep it simple. So let's move our warehouse DB context definition. So we have it here, and just add missing namespaces. By the way, in the .NET 6, we won't need those nesting, and we can define those global imports, but this will come in a .NET 6. And we are yet here about .NET 5. So, okay, the only thing that we are missing is the register product comment. So for that, as I mentioned, I prefer to split the application code. So HTTP request, HTTP status, IOC, etc., from the business domain. I prefer to keep the domain clean. So that's why I will create a separate file for our comment, because as I mentioned, at least for me, comment is something that should be in a domain layer. And let's cut and paste our comment definition. Let's add that. Yep, looks good. And right now we also have everything here. So right now, let's define how we can make that more manageable. So how to split our further spaghetti code or upcoming spaghetti code into better concern separation. So personally, I prefer to not use the command as the request from our API. Usually command is not precisely the same, especially that in request we are expecting a primitive types like string, number, etc., because we are deserializing that from JSON, which has mostly like a primitive types. And here, if we would like to use product, then we could define also like a value object for SKU that will be also validating itself for the specific format. So have a specific value object definition here. So that gives us a lot of flexibility. And if we will be passing this comment to our handlers, then we are sure that this code is following the rules. And for data transfer objects like HTTP requests, records are great, and I really strongly encourage to use it. But I also encourage you to always make all of that nullable, because then you know that you expect to have anything. So that can be null, that might have wrong format, etc. But we will be just deserializing this request. And then we will be using that request to construct the comment. And records has also other useful stuff. So object deconstruction. And object deconstruction allows us to, like if you were using TypeScript, then it allows to just get the properties with the lowercase from the record definition. So it's making code a bit more clearer. I'm also using here a method like fromBody, and fromBody is a simple extension method that is just making sure that the request is defined and body is not empty. So I also defined other methods like get from query, from root, with simple validation, and all of that HTTP extensions can be put within like 100 lines of code when using stakes like 10 or 15. I'm also defined like created, not found, return JSON to simplify our processing. So let's get back to our deserialization. So we define our request class to use records and to be all nullable. And here I will be showing you also the example that comment doesn't have to be precisely the same structure as request. For example, if we are creating new product, then we might not want to send an ID from the UI from various reasons. So, or we might be passing also some other less number of properties. So we can define a product ID here, and then we will construct our comment using this factory method. Right now, we will be checking all the business rules that we defined in the in our factory method. And Andreas has a concern that serialization is kind of snapshot of already valid object. This might be true for events. If the object is generated by our code, then we might be sure or almost sure, as we get into that this object is valid. And I agree. For events, we need to just accept what we have. That's also the reason why I didn't define those rule checks here in the constructor, because we just have to accept as it is if that was an event. This create method will be only called in our code logic. And after that, we are calling this factory method. Then we know that this object is following all the most recent rules. And especially for events in event sourcing, that's quite critical to have that split, because our events might be changing as the time flow. So if we split the object construction from deserialization to be in the constructor to the object creation, then we could do some tricks like, for example, we didn't, let's say that we added new field, like a number or so. And we didn't have this number before. Let's say that this is an event product registered. Then we could do such tricks like here we can not allow to provide without the number, like if number null, then throw exception. But here we can define some default value like, I don't know, 100 for some reason. So we can do some tricks and help our simple case versioning. But that's for an event, because for comment, we don't expect to get the wrong comment, but we might have, because someone might be sending a malicious request, and we always need to validate that. And the validation is happening here, because our request is just accepting whatever it comes. And we have clear place when we are doing the semantic validation. Of course, that shouldn't be like a full business logic, because that should be verified within the business code. And we could go further and use other extension methods that I showed you before. So we can get the DB context. Yeah. So we could use all the other methods like that one. So send comment and return created status. And we get into the send comment right now. So after all that refactorings, then endpoint becomes much shorter and much more concise and much more explicit. So at first, we are getting all the data from request, then we are constructing the command, sending it, and then we are returning the response, and we can use for that some extension method. And what send command is about? If we go to that definition, then send command is just using get command handler, which is just getting the command handler from IOC and then calling the handle method. This is a useful pattern. We don't need to use mediator. We can, if we prefer, we can also inject here some decorator, or we can inject decorator during the registration. So we don't need to use any specific frameworks. We can just keep it simple. But of course, we need to create a handler for our command. And handler for our command can look like that. So let's put it together with the registering product. Let's just import all the other things that we need. So again, we are getting data from request, then we are constructing command, sending it, and then we are returning some status, HTTP status. And in our handler, we are just getting the command. We are running some simple validation. As I mentioned, CQRS and command processing doesn't mean that you cannot read any data. You can, whatever you need to just process your business logic. So this is an example how you can inject to keep your domain clean. So you can inject instead of DB context, you can, for example, inject a function that will take a product number and return Boolean if product exists or not. And after that, we are just calling an add product function. Again, no reference to the framework. And we can just inject in our configuration the code that we were using in our initial version. So add to DB context or add and save changes. And if we prefer, then further on, we could inject here a code to append an event to event store or whatever we prefer. So we are keeping our domain code, which is the command handling, clean. And we are also keeping our code, the endpoint code, clean in the same way. But here we are focusing on how to prepare the command to be following the rules that we expected, then send it, and then return some status or some simple result. But as you see, the command handler is not returning any data. It's just running the business logic, and that's all. And for query, this will be exactly the same. So we would define again a root. And in a root, we could use similar methods. So we could define that the endpoint, and we could get the ID from root. we can then create a query that's following our pattern. So we are making sure that product ID is not empty and so on and so forth. Then we are using the similar method like a command handler. So send query. Then if result is null, then return not found. If was found, then okay with data. And as you can see, with those simple extension method, we can compose our code better, make it more explicit, but still readable and clean. So we don't need to use any sophisticated frameworks, and we don't have to use controllers. And here, how the query handling will look like. It's a bit different than the command handling, because in the command handling, this is our business domain, and we would like to keep it framework agnostic. But if we are doing query, then we should rely on the specific query information. And that also impacts how we test the code, because the business domain can be unit tested, but I really encourage to not try to unit test any database call, database connection. Even entity framework has in-memory context, but it's much different with the capabilities from the regular queries that are run on the database. Especially if we are not using entity framework, but Dapper or Mongo or Elasticsearch, then it might be even impossible to test, unit test it. So nowadays, spinning up Docker container is really easy. So for query handling, we should be injecting an exact query API that we are using and just run the query. So in this particular case, that's extremely simple. We are just getting the product by ID and then creating a result. And as you see, we are just getting the product, the same product that we stored in our command handling. So as you see, Cqrs can be done even on the single database table. So it's not about storage, it's about behavior. And that also gives us other benefits, like, for example, querying or availability search. If we at first implement that on the relational database, but then we see that we need some more sophisticated full text search, then we could replace that much easier with and switch to, for example, Elasticsearch, because then we can just take the specific query handling, replace our query engine or database, or move it even to some other microservice. We have much higher flexibility. And the other thing that is really important is that when we are working with the code, if we get our Jira ticket, then usually it means like change the single endpoint and do update some business logic. So if we keep our endpoint definition together with our business logic for that, then we don't need to jump around the code base. We don't need to have context switching. It's much easier to be focused instead of just jumping, okay, here we have controller, here we have a model class, here we have a DB context. So also Cqrs is, in my opinion, helping a lot in that. So what I would like you to get from this webinar is that Cqrs is really simple pattern, because it only defines that commands and queries should be segregated. Commands should be mutating the state and maybe return some status, as I did, but they should not be, the intent is not to get data, and query handling is about getting the data, not about getting the side effects. And if we are slicing our code base with the business features, then it's much easier and much more manageable and more straightforward to then later on work with the code. If you don't like endpoints, you could even try to apply that for your controllers. You don't need to follow all the patterns that I explained here. You can also just use records, but I wanted to explain you my way, how I'm doing, because I'm really a huge fan of type-driven development also, to be sure that our types are good, but that's not necessary if you don't want to do it. So as you see, I didn't use any Kafka or RabbitMQ. I didn't use event sourcing nor event store DB. In a next webinar, I would like to expand this example and use also event sourcing and event store DB to show that CQRS works really well with event sourcing. But I wanted to just get to the roots and explain you and bust some it. And that's all from my side. Thank you all for being here. And if you have any more questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you, Asser. I'm really glad that you like it. Is the code base available on GitHub repo? Yes, it is. I will paste you that on the chat window. Let me just open GitHub. I have it. Yeah, it's here. So I pasted that. Sorry, to all. Yeah, now you should have the link. It's already on my repo. Will the recording be available? As far as I know, it will be available for the people that were on the webinar. I know that previous webinar was also available to just register and get it. So I think that it should be also available for others. What question? We have a question from Andreas. If I have a CRUD service where the post returns data right away, would I then do basically fake that inside the controller, call the command and call the query right away? Yeah, I mean, if you really have to do that, then yes, endpoint code on controller code can be used as some anti-corruption layer or API gateway. Of course, that's a gray matter. In general, it's better to keep our also not only API design, but also UI design, because they should be aligned. Following the patterns that if you are modifying something, then you don't expect that to get the data. But for some reason, for some cases, pragmatically, some orchestration done on controller is a valid approach. So yes, you can also at first send command and then send query right away, because nothing stops you to get that and paste it here, right? So you could get the result and you can pass the query, and in theory, you could return OK and just paste that. You know, it's doable, right? So nothing stops you from that besides maybe sanity. But so the general advice is try to avoid that. Talk to the business, talk to the UI designers to also be aligned on that regards. But pragmatically, that's doable, and that's how you can do it. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Peter. I'm glad that you like that. Thank you, Stefan. And we have question from Andrzej. How CQRS is different to CQS? CQS is a pattern that was defined by Bertrand Meyer when he was working on the Eiffel language design at Microsoft. And CQS is more about the code structure. So as you see here, so this class is in fact the implementation of the CQS pattern. So CQS is the command query separation. So CQRS is an extension of CQS. It's brought on the architecture level. So I would say that CQRS is about the specific class and specific path and specific behavior that you are implementing. So as I said, question should not change the answer, and comment should be doing something but not returning anything in general. So that's CQRS, and CQRS is what you see on the left. Andrzej, I'm not sure whether you are still here, but that's something that how I differentiate that. So Greg Young also said that CQRS is just bringing the CQRS principle on the higher architecture level. Okay. What else do we have here? When you copy a record with the with keyword, does it passes in constructor? If we define records as I show, then it's using the constructor. But if we are not using this specific pattern, sorry, in record, you need to have all of the properties defined within the constructor. So in fact, with keyword is like a copy constructor. Bart Van has a question, can it be done using TDD, where the test would be in the project structure? Yes, it can be done like that. I have even some tests for that commented out. Sorry. Yeah, okay, those are API tests, but maybe let's get back. I already mentioned that. So I would add here like a separate project for unit tests, and I would be testing the unit testing the business logic, so command handlers, because as you can see, there are not reference to the framework besides the .NET framework. So it can be perfectly done with the TDD. Regarding endpoints, it can be also done in TDD. I even have the test, they are commented out here because the code wouldn't be compiling, but right now it should be. In the repository, they are already working fine. So as you can see, you could even define the API tests, so the endpoint tests, and provide that if you are running the query for not an existing ID, then it should return 404, etc. And if you are getting the existing project, then it should be also returning the valid data, like here, or OK. So even endpoints can be written in a TDD approach. Of course, it wouldn't be unit testing, but API testing, but still you can write all the API tests upfront, and then while you're working with the root, you can make sure that everything is working fine. What else do we have here? What about sequence in DB? How you know the new sequence? Is a command if a command cannot return something? So as you see here, that was a question from Stefan. So I'm just using the dumbest method of generating the object. So there are two ways that you could create an ID. I usually doing that by getting some specific class, like sorry, I'm not great at typing and talking. Get required service. So we can get the specific service, like I product ID generator. And this generator we could use later on to, for example, call generate. Or we could, to make it more readable, then we could do it like that. And then we could use this generator to generate the new ID. And this implementation might be just getting that ID from database. Of course, it has some downsides, because if the main logic here fail later on, or even the command definition will fail, then we might have some gaps in our sequence. To that, we would need to wrap it in a transaction, but then we are compromising the performance. The other way, but then we can't return the ID easily, is to generate that ID in the command handler. So we could inject a function that would just return a string, generate project ID, and then we could call it here. Maybe let's do it like that. Yep. So we could call it like that. And then we could use it here. But then we cannot return this product ID and use it in our root. So what I saw, what people are doing, but I'm not a huge fan of that, is that for the create commands, because that's only an issue for the create command, they are adding something like public created ID with a public setter. So that makes our command not immutable, which is not great. That's why I'm not such a huge fan of that. And then after that, they are assigning that newly generated value. Sorry, let's do it like that. Newly generated value to this property, okay, created ID. And then you could use it like that. And then after that, after you the logic was run successfully, then you can use this property and return the information also here in the response. The downside is that if the command was sent through the HTTP or gRPC to other service, then during the serialization, this data will be lost. So that only works for the in-memory processing, and it's also far from being great. So normally, I prefer to be quite optimistic in a way. Let's maybe clean it up a bit. I prefer to be a bit more optimistic and use ID generator like that. Then I can just be sure that the ID is generated, sent with command. And I expect that rarely there will be happening that there are some issues here. So I hope that, Stefan, that explained your question. And wow, one more thing. The benefit of injecting the generator here is that we can, as I show it here, we can run the generation logic after we also validated the other business logic. So at the end, so as with every computer problem and software problem, it's all about trade-offs. So there is no good, easy answer for that. Okay, let's see if I have more questions that I skipped. If you have more questions, then feel free to ask them. I'm just right now scrolling through other questions. In a typical CRUD application, the UI would directly get information about the created product. Here we return nothing. So I believe that I already show you how to return the created information. And you can also use the orchestration And if we are returning created, then I'm also setting the location header. And location header, if you are using the browser, then if the 201 is returned with the location header, then it will be automatic. The browser will do automatic redirection and get the data from the get endpoint that we provided. So as we implemented here both endpoints, so create and get, then this will work out of the box for the browsers. So the combination of the status and location header with the proper redirection to get by ID to newly created. Andreas wrote that I came to realize that microservice is more related to growth and team structure, not so much to technology. I fully agree with that. There are also some benefits from the technical standpoint, like especially around DevOps and being able to deploy easier just changes from the specific module. But I agree, mostly it's about the autonomous team and how they collaborate. But usually I prefer to start with, as I showed here, so with the logical split. Then if it appears that it might be worth to move it to some other service, or as I prefer to call the deployment unit, then we could take this whole folder, move it to other project, deploy it differently. CQS and Cqrs difference. I hope, Andrzej, that I explained that. Will it not the rules in the factory method be bypassed when I deserialize? So I think that I already answered that yes, they will, but that's how we would like to have it, at least for events. Normally, the code is run in the application code, and after that, we are sure that this query or comment is created properly. Okay. Thank you, Alexei. I'm glad that you like it. Thank you, Rolf. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. I will give you maybe 1 more minute. If something pops up, then you can find me on Twitter. Let me just bring it again. So you can find me on Twitter. I also wrote a lot about this example on my blog, so you can check it. And yeah, I would be really grateful for any feedback, especially constructive criticism that will help me to improve and make the further webinars better. So thank you all. No more questions. So I'm closing the webinar. I hope that you like that and you spent a nice afternoon with me. So bye. See you later. Bye. Thanks, Pavel. Thanks, Samsu. Thanks, Augustine. Thanks, Julian, Rolf, Christian. Thank you a lot. Thanks, Andrzej. Thanks, Ahmed. Thanks, Manuel, Peter, Florian, Javier, Sengis. Thank you. Thank you a lot for being here.